right, good afternoon, everyone. While we're waiting for more people to come into the EOSC-hub webinar, I'm going to go through a few reminders just before we start. So before we begin, I'm Rob Curlio from Trust IT Services and the EOSC-hub project, and I'm very pleased to be hosting this webinar and introducing it. But before we begin, a couple of reminders. Firstly, this webinar is recorded and will be accessible on demand later on. The slides will also be sent to you via email one day after the webinar. For those joining us in this live session, please do keep your questions until the end. And questions will be conducted by raising your hand through the Zoom functionality. But first, before we begin, just a quick introduction about EOSC-hub. So EOSC-hub aims to deliver the integration and management system of EOSC, acting as a European entry point for all stakeholders. There are 20 digital research infrastructures with EGI, UDAT, and Indigo Data Cloud, jointly offering services, software, and data for advanced data-driven research and innovation. We're a 33 million euro project, gathering over 100 partners from 53 countries and more than 150 staff involved. The coordinator is the EGI Foundation. So some of the main activity areas that we work in include services, federation services, such as AI, accounting, monitoring, and help desk, etc. Policies and processes, such as security regulations, terms of use, and fair implementation guidelines, as well as federated operations, including lightweight certification, SLA negotiation, etc. So today, specifically for this webinar, one of the session today touches upon one of the key exploitable results of EOSC-hub, specifically the service management system. And today, the presentation will be provided by Owen Appleton, who is a service portfolio manager at the EGI Foundation, working on the service strategy, service portfolio management, IT service management training and consultancy. Owen was a leading author of the FitAssembly standard and is a certified FitAssembly trainer. He also holds an expert certification in FitAssembly, as well as certifications in ITIL and ISO 27000. He also leads the service portfolio management activities in the EOSC-hub project. And with that, we now pass the floor to our speaker, Owen. Over to you.
Hey, everyone. Thanks for that introduction, Rob. That was very good. Let me share my screen and then we can get started. So you should, in just a moment, you should see my slides now.
Yes.
As Rob said, we're here today for this EOSC-hub webinar to talk about managing services and resources for EOSC. Let me be honest, this is quite a whistle-stop tour of something that we could talk about for a very large amount of time, but hopefully in something around an hour, we're going to get some understanding of how EOSC deals with managing services and other resources and what support you can get in doing that. So to jump right in, since I've already been well introduced, these are the kind of things I wanted to cover today. A little tiny bit about EOSC and onboarding, talking about the provider and resource profiles, which, as you'll see, is what EOSC asks you to fill these days. Having a discussion about how we have some structure around services and resources and their delivery and what promises we can make, how we manage that, and then we're going to talk about one particular approach, which is one I'm very familiar with, and is also the approach that the EOSC-hub project has been using, the FitAssembly standard. I think this touches on things I've spoken about many times in other contexts, although this is the first time they're put together in this way. But if you want more information on any of the elements within this, I believe there are quite a lot of other discussions at conferences that are recorded online, or you can ask us for support certainly afterwards. So first, and I can't go into this in too much depth, what is this thing called EOSC? Hopefully, those of you listening have some familiarity with what we're talking about. But I want to mention a couple of things about this, which I think are interesting to discuss at this stage. First, it's called the European Open Science Cloud, but the more I spend time around this concept, the more I think the name is probably not the most appropriate one for a few reasons. First, I don't really think it's just science. I mean, this may be seeming like a small point, but there is a world of research that goes beyond the world of scientific research. And certainly the contributions of the digital humanities, of the arts communities, are incredibly important and valuable in stitching together the European research area. So while the name is one we're stuck with, I think bear in mind that this is not just science, this is really all research we see in Europe. Also, you know, to be honest, it's not really a cloud. I think maybe this was a conception at an early stage, but what it actually is an ecosystem or a commons for open research across Europe. So bringing together all of the actors involved, trying to connect up what they do to a greater extent, having greater coherency, having standardized or structured funding, reporting, all of these sort of things. And although I've said it's European, I mean, there's certainly a question mark here. This is definitely a European effort, but we already are drawing, you know, making links to other parts of the world. And I think we have to definitely understand that while what we do in Europe should serve Europe and European needs, and certainly that's something I believe in strongly, at the same time, we do live in a global research community as well. So there are at least links outside of that. However, having criticized the name of the whole thing I'm involved with, I will at least point out that open is definitely something that, that is a major priority for EOSC. We are also trying to support, to the extent possible, open research, open data, open science. We all understand not everything can be immediately open. There are reasons we have embargoes on things, but I still think that this is really open by design, as open as possible. These are the sort of approaches we try and take for EOSC. So what is it? I guess for me, EOSC is an ecosystem to link all of the digital research resources in Europe. I'll use the word resources quite a lot, although I'll also use the word services quite a lot. Just to explain that briefly, in dealing with EOSC, we've become quite aware that at times there is a division in the IT research world between those who mostly deal with services and those who mostly deal with data. And we've come to understand together that you can't put either above the other. They're both required to make the other make any sense. So we use the term resources or EOSC resources to cover the totality of all of the services, all of the data, all of the publications, software, any other research product which you can put together in EOSC. Now, clearly you have to treat these slightly differently. And what we're going to be talking about today primarily is IT service management, which we'll get to in a minute. So that's on the service side. But a lot of these concepts and structures and processes can also apply to data and other research products as well. Still, this is why we have this terminology. So it's an ecosystem to link all this together. It's a shared network of core services, and these are mostly services, things that keep this big federation going. It is catalogs of resources of all types that are interconnected. It's interoperability frameworks to allow all these elements to work with each other, and coherent support to allow for training and education and promotion to the scientific communities and the research communities. If you're from the IT side, which I imagine many of the people listening might be, you could call this a sort of enterprise bus for IT and research. This is a concept from computing of a sort of connector that allows translation between a whole load of different modules, to give a sort of very general idea. So EOSC is a bringing together of many heterogeneous and disparate but valuable things to try and make them work in a more coordinated way than they have in the past. Another term, which we're going to see a lot or have seen a lot around EOSC, is onboarding. And I need to explain what this is, because this is going to really drive a lot of the things we're talking about today. Onboarding basically means taking some resource and connecting it to EOSC. So describing you yourself as a provider of resources and the resources you want to put into EOSC. And again, this resource could be service data, whatever. And doing that using a standardized metadata format, which we call an EOSC profile. There are different profiles for providers and for resources. By doing that, by describing yourself in that standards compliant way, it's possible to expose those resources through one or more portals or catalogs that are compliant with this EOSC system. This means that certainly resources can be exposed through EOSC portal, which is the sort of current central website for EOSC, but also once they're all connected up next year through a wide variety of thematic and regional portals for specific communities, whether they are, say, the Italian national research community, or it could be the photon and neutron community that comes together through the PANOSC project. There are many, many others. The idea being that by having this common way of describing things, resources can be exposed throughout this system of systems, throughout this larger network. This has many benefits. I mean, one of them is certainly to bring new users for your resources, and maybe users who hadn't expected they might find your resources useful. There are all sorts of unexplored synergies between the research we do, which we hope that will be enabled by EOSC. Also, by describing your resources in this way, it's the first step to integration with EOSC and what EOSC offers through its core. The EOSC core is a bunch of capabilities which fundamentally are very boring to researchers, but they're very interesting to IT people, and the researchers will benefit from them. This is common systems for not only listing services in a catalog, but also for being able to order them, potentially with financial transactions involved in the future, monitoring their availability, accounting for the use of them, having common AAI, so authorization to be able to access them using your existing credentials, common help desks and support channels, and many other sort of housekeeping internal services, which EOSC uses itself for its kind of core, but also offers for integration to service providers. So rather than creating your own ordering or monitoring system, you can piggyback off or benefit from the central one, which both saves you time and also lets you be part of a sort of larger continuum of work where your information is comparable and useful with everyone else's. And in the future, we think this integration will offer other things as well. We think it'll offer new ways to be reimbursed for use of services. Already, if you're involved in European Commission funded projects, you may be aware of the virtual access instruments, which allow you to basically be paid for use of your services by the EC through a project structure. We imagine there will be a number of new ways to be reimbursed for services if EOSC is going to move forward and be successful, because there will always be a need to pay people for the usage they consume. Also, one thing we really hope to build toward is composability between resources. This will never be possible universally. You won't be able to take any building block and put it with any other block like a sort of scientific Lego set, but we really hope that a lot of the elements within EOSC can be very easily plugged together using an interoperability framework, common standards and APIs to really facilitate being able to use this data set with this processing system, with this visualization system, with this archiving system, really a greater level of plug and play, certainly within the big scientific communities, if not across them. So this is kind of what onboarding to EOSC means, what it means to bring your resources to EOSC before we get to the managing them part. And I want to show you roughly what the process of onboarding looks like. This used to be, frankly, quite manual and complicated, and now is a much more automated, streamlined system, which was launched just in November. This was launched by EOSC-hub together with the EOSC Enhanced project, who have a lot of responsibility here. So basically, well, 5 steps in here, but it's not actually that complicated because the first 2 steps and the 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 are kind of a mirror of each other. If you want to bring your resources to EOSC, which we really very much hope you do, the first thing you have to do is submit yourself as a provider to EOSC. You have to basically describe, well, you have to log in for a start, and there is a little barrier to entry there. There are many different login systems which are available, so this is pretty much always achievable, or we can support you in doing this. But you log in, you create yourself an account, and then you submit an entry for a resource provider. This involves some fairly basic information that's required about, what's the name of your organization, where is it, what kind of entity is it? Is it a legal entity? Is it a foundation? Is it a project? But there are questions here about quite how we accept projects. They're perhaps an interestingly difficult case. Also, what's the contact information? What kind of organization are you? What area do you serve? Do you serve a particular thematic domain, or are you a more sort of horizontal organization? There's a fairly complete form you have to fill in. Not all of it is required, and in fact, probably only quite a small amount of it is required. There's lots of optional information there, which some communities want to share because it's in their interest to explain. For instance, there are a whole set of categories around ESFRI projects, because they have a whole load of specific, should we say, parameters around them about what kind of S3 project they are, where they are in the S3 life cycle, which don't apply to anyone else, but we want to allow them to also record that data. So reasonable sized form, smaller amount that's required. There is then a sort of an appropriateness check. Are you really an organization which we want to be a part of EOSC? This is about applying rules of participation that have been determined by the governance layer of EOSC, which involves national representatives from all across Europe. And really is, are you an organization trying to serve the research sector? We're trying to avoid bringing in providers of resources that are just totally unrelated to research, because it will just essentially kind of clog things up. Once you've done that, you can submit a resource. This resource may well be a service, might be a data set, piece of software, publication, whatever. You have to describe this. There is a sort of generic part to the resource description, which really could cover any sort of resource. Then there are more specific parts. And to be honest, right now, this is only fully set up for services. We expect there to be the more full-featured set for research products, for data set software, early next year. This is something that's currently in development, but this was first done mostly for services. That's why there's a sort of skew that way. And this is, I mean, hopefully we'll have a little look at it later. This is a fairly extensible system where we hope that other people may use this format and add their own parameters onto the end of it that are useful for their community. But again, there's a pretty long form, but by no means all of it is required. There's some core information we have to have. There's a whole lot that's optional because you may want to expose it to potential customers or users. Once this is submitted, depending on whether it's your first resource or not, it may be manually checked or it may just be automatically pushed through to publication. There is an auditing step. There's some quality management here. We, as the managers of this registry of resources for EOSC, have to check that resources are kept up to date, that they're correct, that all the links work. I mean, some fairly basic stuff, but also more complicated stuff. Make sure that we're not breaking any competition rules, make sure that we're not breaking any legislation, make sure that a resource is what it says it is. And once this happens, it is automatically published. So it's automatically pulled out of the web portal, which providers use to onboard their resources, into a public-facing marketplace, which allows it to be exposed to researchers, potentially ordered if you want to set up integrated ordering, and we hope in future also exposed not only through one marketplace, but perhaps through many across Europe from different thematic and regional communities. So what is it you have to fill in? This is the so-called EOS profiles, and I've put at the top of this slide some URLs which hopefully will point you to the things that we're talking about here if you want to have a look yourself. The top URL is the EOS provider documentation page, which has a bunch of different useful documentation. And then there's some links there to a PDF and an Excel version of the current version of the EOS profiles, the provider and resource profiles. We'll look at them in a little bit of detail here, but obviously we can't go through every page of them and it'll come quite small on the screen. So I do encourage you to follow along at home as well, if that's of interest to you. Okay, so what are these resource profiles? They're available from this provider documentation page. They're essentially a metadata schema for describing resources. That's really all they are, but they are one that's used by the EOSC-hub. So this very large project mentioned by Rob, which is why we're providing this webinar. Also by EOSC Enhance, which basically runs the portal for EOSC. By the Open Air Advanced project, which is from the open science domain. They're moving into using this. And it will also be used in future for a project called EOSC Future, which is the next sort of phase of EOSC construction, which is due to start early next year and is currently in negotiation with the EC. And there's an even larger project than the EOSC-hub. So there's already quite a kind of momentum around this as a structure. It is a consensus structure that's been created by putting together, merging and refining templates templates for this purpose from a whole bunch of different people across a whole bunch of different projects. So it represents what we think is probably the state of the art, or at least the best current solution to how to describe providers and resources. And we've really gone through many iterations to get to this. It's also open for others to use. It's released under Creative Commons. So for communities that haven't yet come up with a way to list their services or their other resources, we very much encourage them to use it, because if they want to interact with EOSC, they will have to either use this profile or be able to map whatever they're doing to this profile, so they won't be able to escape it one way or another. However, future versions of this profile, these profiles, will be available for consultation. The initial version pushed out recently in November, so-called version 3, because it's in fact building on version 2 from a whole bunch of different people. This was basically centrally written by a smaller group of people, but for future updates, there will definitely be more consultation with the community to make sure it fits their needs. So, like I said, it's intended to empower EOSC registries of resources, support the next big project, and allow communities to either use it or map it to their current community registry. We're going to have a little look inside, although in not too much detail. These are basically just the sections of the provider profile. So this is the first thing you have to fill in. Basic information is, your name, who you are, some description. We also allow for some marketing information. So what do you want to tell people about what your organization does? I think this certainly is useful for people in selecting organizations they feel they can trust from whom to use their resources. There's some classification information about which scientific domains you work in or which kinds of resource you provide. There's some location information, where you are, what regions do you serve. The reason this might be relevant is while EOSC is Europe-wide, we definitely want to include, for instance, regional services. It may be that there are national services which are really only available to people from one country, but it may not be that all researchers in those countries know about them. So we certainly think there's something that could be brought into EOSC, even if they're not fully open for everyone across Europe to use. It would be good to increase the usage of national and regional services through exposing them to researchers who may not have already found them. There's some information on maturity as well, and some sort of generic other information. But these are pretty standard sections. If we look at the resource profile, so you fill in the provider profile once, and then the resource profile once per resource you want to onboard. This is a little longer, but in fact, a lot of it is the same. You still see basic information, marketing information, maturity information. Classification is still there. We get into some other things, though. We have to talk about geographical and language information. So what languages are your resources available in? This is something that people are going to have to be able to filter by. Are there any dependencies? Do you have to use any other resources? For instance, if we think about some of the Google services, you have to have a Google account already in order to use some additional Google services. There are some dependencies there. That can happen within EOSC as well. Contact information, attribution, who's funding it. This is pretty important. Access and order information. And each of these sections looks something like this. And again, we're going to zoom in a bit to this, and you can follow it along at home yourself. So I don't expect you to be able to read it in detail, but for every section in this model, there is a unique code. There's a name for the attribute. There's a value, whatever you fill in. There's also some recommendation about whether or not this is something that you have to fill in or is optional. There's some definition. There's an idea of the type of information. Are we looking for text? Are we looking for a single line? Are we looking for a paragraph of text? And is this information made public? We do ask for some information which isn't made public. A good example is security contacts. So security contacts are something that EOSC, as the central bodies of EOSC as they evolve, will need to know. In case there's a breach of an individual service or a breach of the central registry, we need to be able to tell the appropriate people, but those contacts don't have to be available to everyone. Still, we need to ask about them. We just need to be clear that they're not going to be made public. And then down in the bottom left corner here, I will try and use the laser pointer function, which is quite fun. You can see management information, and this we're going to come back to in a minute because this is a lot of what we're really going to talk about today. Right, so let's just have a brief look. This is again a zoom in on the basic information, and this is really, like I said, simplistic things. What's the name, and what's the ID? There is a sort of unique ID assigned to each resource. Which organization provides a resource? So here, I mean, this is actually a non-real example, but we have a resource organization, OpenAir, and we have resource providers, CERN and GRNet. There's a distinction here that allows for federated scenarios. So the resource organization is the one that is onboarding the resource and is responsible for it. But we know that many services are delivered by collaborations. So we allow you to list other providers who may also have contributed to a resource. And we think this is a useful feature. Basic stuff also like the web page. If I then jump ahead right to probably the most complicated part of the information, it's the management information. Some of this may seem for some of you relatively simple, but our experience is this is where most of the questions or problems come up, because we start to ask for things which, while for the commercial sector might be quite standard and regular to ask for the research sector, for the academic sector, are more unusual and sometimes require quite a lot of thought or sometimes some internal work in order to be able to provide. I would say not many organizations who have onboarded resources in the last year have had all of this to hand straight away. So if you don't worry. But here we're asking for things like a help desk page. Again, this may seem very simple, but quite a lot of organizations have no help desk function. They don't even have a standard help email address. They may have an individual person's email because they're a very small provider and there are only very few people with expertise to provide support on it. That's something which probably isn't great in the longer term. For scalability, we would prefer to see some form channel for support which isn't reliant on one individual not being on holiday, for instance. But we don't expect everyone to have a help desk. However, to kind of roll back a little bit, we talked about EOS core services earlier, and help desk is one of the ones I mentioned. So in future, this may be something that EOS can provide to resource providers. If you don't have your own help desk functionality, we may be able to help with that, because this is something which we could do sort of help desk as a service. We asked for a user manual. Hopefully this is pretty straightforward. People are able to tell people how to use their resources. We also ask for terms of use, a privacy policy and an access policy. And several of these are required. Well, actually, no, this is optional here. In general, I believe a privacy policy is something that is required these days. And this can cause some people problems. The feeling from the groups building EOSC is that in light of GDPR, in light of all sorts of concerns about the privacy of personal information, it's important that providers offer some statement on the privacy of the people who use their resources, on how they will deal with the information that they gather from them, on what is a reasonable way to do that. And that should be structured in some fairly standardized way. EOSC is not generally going to check whether you have a good privacy policy, but it will want to check whether there is one there. And there's support available for many of these things. There are standard templates or bits of guidance in writing these things, but these are the sort of things where it might trip people up because they might not have a privacy policy to hand, or they may have one for their whole university, but that doesn't really represent the specific service or resource you're talking about. Terms of use, similarly. What are the terms under which you're happy for someone to use your service? What limitations do you place on them? This is something which may not always be in place targeted to a particular resource. And if I skip to the other page of management information and some related information, I just want to really pull up the top one here, the service level. So potential service level agreements. Service level agreements are not required for now by EOSC, although they may be required in future. I personally think that's quite likely. But service level agreements, for those that don't know, are documents which determine or state the conditions under which and the manner in which a service is delivered. So how available is the service? Is it available 24 hours a day or only during business hours? What capacity is available? How much space can I use in this storage service? How much data can I process in this processing service? How will a provider respond if I have a complaint or I want to raise an issue that needs to be fixed? This is an area which I'm very familiar with because that's my background, but a lot of people in the research sector aren't, not because they don't think about these things, but because it's not necessarily formatted in this way for them in their organizations and in their experience. So we've been surprised how many people need support in trying to onboard their resources with issues around this. There are also a couple of other areas here, access and order information and financial information, which can get pretty tricky pretty quickly. Financial information is interesting because as long as things are being given away for free by projects, there's no difficulty. But I think we all are probably quite aware that we're coming to the end of that phase in European research projects. There's a much greater need for things to be sustainable and to have a sustainability plan and some sort of long-term resourcing plan. And because of that, I think increasingly we're going to see the requirement for more information about how things are paid for. So basically, what are we doing? We're gathering a bunch of information. Some of it's pretty basic, names, contacts. Some of it's marketing information. I would call this stuff relatively straightforward. However, the management information, the terms of use, privacy policies, security policies, support channels, SLAs, issues of access, order and payment, these can be surprisingly complicated. And I think they become more complicated the more you think about them. Often what's happened in our community, assuming most of you are from the research community, is that many of these things exist to some extent, but in an ad hoc, not particularly integrated way. There are some statements about security. There are some statements about privacy. There may be some elements that you might say go into an SLA and something about an access and order system. But those things aren't coherent. They're not plugged together. And once you try and drill into them, quite often things get super complicated very quickly. And while this is okay in a project where you have a long time to engage with your users' communities, if we're working through a sort of marketplace model, something closer to this in EOSC, this stuff is all going to have to be a lot clearer. And to try and explain kind of why we end up with these problems, my feeling is that we start asking questions and then they just lead on to other questions. So I'll try and give you some examples. There's a bunch of questions here which you often see come up. What's my security policy? So what is your security policy? Well, how do you answer that question? You could write a security policy just what you think is a good idea at the time, but in the end, that would be less defensible and probably less useful than something more structured. So if you're trying to be more structured about your security policy, you're going to have to ask, what assets are you protecting? While if we're talking about financial resources, if you want to know what financial resources do you need, you have to understand what costs do I have. Now, one issue related to both security and assets and also costs for financial issues is risk management. So what risks do I have? And then how do I control these risks? Can I really set a price for my services if I don't know what risks I have and I have some method of controlling them to make sure I can deliver on this price? How can I make some statement about what security I offer if I don't have active ways to manage the security of the information assets and my computing systems or my IT systems that I'm delivering? If we go a little bit further down, what parameters do I state for my services and other resources? So what's in my SLA? Well, the first thing you have to do here is think about what do you offer? What resources do you actually offer? This may seem like a simple question, but through probably coming up 10 years of experience in trying to ask people this from the research sector, most organizations know what activities they perform, but they may not think of them in terms of value generating services in the way that a more formal management system would. And if you ask yourself what resources do you offer, you're quickly going to get to, okay, what services do I offer? But in order to say something about that, to make some guarantee in an SLA, some promise, I need to know what capacity do I have? What availability can I offer? There are crosslinks. When I talk about availability, I have to think about risks. What are the risks which are knocking down my service? Is it things that I can control within my organization? Or is it that my power supply in my site is rather dodgy, so occasionally my services go down? If I know my capacity and availability, what promises can I make about it? And then right down the bottom, if you think about support, if in order to provide support, you need to understand who your users, your customers are. You probably need to understand that in quite a structured way. Again, many people have lists of users, people who've logged into a system, but they may not think about which organizations they represent. They may not have contacted those organizations to build some customer relationship. If you want to know, if you know who your users are, you need to know which resources, which services did they use. And then again, we're going to get into what promises can we make. There are also, even more crosslinks here, which I won't go into, but a lot of the time, we're going to get into bigger questions of control, risk, promises, so what guarantees can we make? And all of this leads to a fundamental question of how do I manage any of this? And it doesn't take long to start from fairly basic questions, which EOSC is going to ask you, not only because EOSC wants to know, but because these are standard ways, these are standard questions you can ask about services and other resources. And you're going to get into not having easy answers unless you have some structure that allows you to answer those questions. So now entering the picture is the wonderful world of IT service management, because that's what this is. And again, to point out, this is a set of structures that are based on how to deal with services. They're primarily built on IT services. However, they do work for other service types. Certainly within my organization, we use this for managing our training services and some of our consultancy services because there's enough overlap that makes sense. And a lot of this will also apply potentially to other resource types than services. But primarily, we're talking about service management here. There will be additions to this which kind of make more sense for data. On the other hand, as another aside, a data source rather than a data set is almost always a service rather than simply a piece of data. Most of the time that you have a data source, there is some service layer wrapped around the data set itself, so you can consider it a service. So, IT service management is a structure and practice for managing IT services and potentially other things in a controlled and realistic way. It's a way to basically bring some order to a potentially chaotic system. It's been used for many, many decades now in the commercial sector, also in the public and research sectors increasingly. None of this is new stuff. It's a way to break down a complex system into manageable chunks, which I'll show you some of in the next slide, policies, procedures, processes, such that you can do something with them. I would also stress that if you want to have a look at service management and you're interested in potentially implementing it, it is definitely not about throwing out everything you do now. It's about evolving your current practice into a more structured way of doing things. But for pretty much everyone involved, although there is a change there, which can be challenging, they should see their work in this new structure that's been created. They should see the work they already do every day. If someone deals with user support, they're dealing with essentially problems or issues that are reported by a user by email or through a ticketing system. They will find their home in incident and service request management within the IT service management sphere. This may be a different set of naming, but it's discussing the same real activity just in a bit of a more structured way. So to use a slightly hackneyed phrase, it's evolution rather than revolution in terms of your practices. Also, it's a way to answer a lot of these complicated questions. So all of those questions from the previous slide, you can answer if you have a service management system, because that's part of the reason you have a service management system. At a high level, I'll give you a glimpse of what a service management system looks like. It's a sort of three-tier system. You can consider this a bit like a pyramid. So as you go down, there's more of these things. At the top level, you have a kind of governance level where you have policies which set out your broad organizational approach to whole areas, to change within the organization, to security, to how incidents are dealt with. In the middle, you have a control layer where you have a set of processes. Different IT service management approaches have different process models, normally somewhere between 10 and 35 different processes. I tend towards the lower end of that number, as you'll see in a minute. These processes are kind of departments, you could call them, or logical chunks within an SMS, a service management system, which deal with one particular topic. Each one has inputs and outputs, it has activities and roles within it, it has goals, it has KPIs, management structures, but they are somewhat separate. So there is one, for instance, about customer relationship management, that's a process. There's another about capacity management, that's a process. So these are the kind of things we have in this control layer. And in the bottom layer, in the operational layer, you really have procedures. You have literally lists of things people have to do as part of their work in order to get these things done. So this is, I mean, a very, very brief schematic of a service management system, but it gives you some idea. I talked about processes. There are different process models. I'm going to show you the process model from the standard that I'm involved with. This is FitAssembly. I won't read all of these, but I'll point out that you start up at the top with service portfolio management, which is kind of what do you do? What services do you offer? What's the purpose of your organization? And the first set of processes are generally kind of more tactical planning, high-level things which you do sort of periodically, maybe once or twice a year, looking at how you manage capacity, how you manage availability and continuity, and plan for it over some period of time, having your approach to information security. At the bottom are the more operational processes. So incident management, this is really normally your help desk. Configuration management is a kind of logical model of all of the elements which contribute to your services. Change management is something a lot of people will have some familiarity with. How do you manage the change of things within your organization in a realistic way? And right down at the bottom, continual service improvement. And this is something which is really embedded in this IT service management approach. You're continually trying to improve, not as a sort of slogan for marketing, but because it's impossible to do this sort of, to implement this sort of system all at once. You do it in small steps, incrementally, and then you keep checking on your progress and keep trying to make plans for the next cycle and advance further. So there's this idea of continual improvement built into all IT service management systems. You do things in a sort of cycle of making a plan, implementing it, seeing what happened, learning from that, making a new plan. Round and round you go. Skip that. I just want to give an idea. You have these 14 processes. Those were the 14 processes from the FitAssembly standard. They have connections to one another, and I think this will help show you how we might be able to answer some of those questions we looked at earlier using a system like this. So the first process one comes across in most service management systems is something like service portfolio management. This is defining the list of the services or other resources that you offer, which is not always super simple, but is always a good starting point. You use this to generate a service portfolio. So a service portfolio is your internal list of what it is you want to offer to customers. This then drives the more public-facing part in what we call service level management. Service level management looks after the public catalog of your services. So there's a difference between your internal and external catalog, because there's information you keep that's only really for you as a provider versus what you show to the users or customers. And apart from that, it also is the place where you generate service level agreements. So based on the list of services or resources you provide, you work out what promises you can make about them. And these SLAs, these service level agreements, you can't just make this stuff up out of thin air. You have to have processes to deliver on all the things you're probably going to make promises about in an SLA. So you have a service reporting management process, which deals with all the reports that you produce either internally or for your users, to tell them about how your service is performing, to demonstrate your quality, to show how you respond to bad situations which you need to resolve. This is also where you generate your reports. You have a process that manages service availability and continuity. So that's managing downtime, but also disaster management. How do you guard against flood, against fire, against earthquakes, depending on where you are in the world? And you have to make plans for that. You have to have a process for managing capacity to make sure that you can deliver the capacity in the agreements you've made with your customers, these SLAs, and you have to have plans to do that as well. So there's a kind of the goal here is to maintain sufficient availability, continuity, capacity to meet your demands from customers. And there's a whole process on information security, which looks at what are the assets you have, what are the risks that those assets can potentially suffer from, and what controls can you implement to control those risks? How can you keep your systems, your data, your information safe? This is a very small part and not all of the connections between these processes, but this gives you an idea that in IT service management, there's a structured way you do things, which not only has these processes, but all their interactions. So if you want to know what promises can you make to someone, you don't just have to make it up. You can say, well, in writing our agreement with our customers, which we use a service level agreement to describe, I can talk to the people who do availability management to understand, can I offer 99% availability or 99.999 or 30%, whatever is appropriate. You have a group that looks at capacity with a set of clear activities they do to work out what capacity you need. You have a group that does information security, etc. So this is the sort of structural underpinnings that allow you to really express these promises to your users and to provide the management information, which isn't just for EOSC, it's also just to make your services good, to make you an efficient organization, to make you an effective organization. So I mean, this is super brief. I'll talk about the training that's available later on this, but these are very small parts of longer training courses, which I and many of my colleagues give, and many of the people in this community have had to sit through, although I think they generally quite enjoy it. I'll just mention briefly, what are the frameworks you can use to do IT service management? And I'll mention a couple here. We'll leave the bottom one because this is IT governance and this is slightly out of scope. But the two probably biggest approaches to managing IT services are ITIL, ITIL, the IT Infrastructure Library, and ISO IEC 20000, which is an international standard from ISO, International Standardization Organization. These two are actually related. ISO 20000 was based on ITIL. ITIL is a best practice framework and is a couple of thousand pages of best practice information about how to manage IT services. It's great, it's fantastic, it's rich and full of content, but a terrible place to start because it will drown you in detail. It won't tell you the really kind of straightforward things you need to know. ISO 20000 was an attempt to turn ITIL into a standard so that you could actually be audited against, which it certainly does. My organization has an ISO 20000 certification, for instance, but it's still pretty heavyweight. I mean, it asks a lot of you as an organization. Neither ITIL nor ISO 20000 have ever had particularly good penetration into the research sector. They really have only been in the commercial and to an extent the public sector. But a number of years ago, starting in 2012, there was a new initiative to try and bring something far more appropriate to the research sector out and bring it to people's attention. And this became a standard called FitAssembly. FitAssembly was actually funded by a European Commission funded FP7 project. And is probably one of the more successful products of an EC project that I know about because it's still going happily today. It's a very lightweight IT service management standard which tries to make things as simple as possible. It tries to target a really achievable level of quality rather than try to go for the highest possible level of quality. And through that is much, much more achievable, much easier to start with. It's also freely available. Everything in it's released under a Creative Commons license. And it's managed or owned by a non-profit, but certification is provided through real professional high quality certification organizations. So you can really have kind of guaranteed credentials that you know about this system. It's also compatible with all of the other major systems in the market. As Rob said earlier, I was one of the people who was involved in creating it. So obviously I have some bias, but it's been very effective. Why is it interesting? Versus some of the competition, ITIL, which I mentioned, about 2,000 pages, lots of good practice, no requirements, no checklist of things you have to do. ISO 20000, which was developed kind of out of ITIL, about 136 pages for the core documents, 26 pages of requirements, so 26 pages of things you have to do to follow this standard. FitAssembly, 38 pages for the core documents and 9 pages of requirements. This is as slim as you can get and still be delivering something of high quality. So this is really brought down to a realistic level for the research sector. It's also built in multiple parts, like many standards are. Right at the top, you've got FitAssembly 0. This is overview and vocabulary. This is really just terms that you need to understand this. FitAssembly 1 is the core of the standard. These are the requirements. So this is a list of, I think, 86 things you have to do in order to manage your services correctly. So quite a manageable number versus other standards. And the rest of the standard isn't things you have to do, it's supporting material. It's an idea of the objectives and activities for all of the processes you need to implement. You get provided a standard role model with a lot of the roles you need within your organization. There are free templates and samples of key documents, guides on how to implement things, a maturity assessment scheme which you can use to sort of self-assess. Again, can't go into too much detail, but there's a lot there which is all freely available under Creative Commons. There's also a training scheme, 3-level training scheme. There is a foundation course, which is very popular in our sector, which is only 1 day, although I would point out it's 1 day face-to-face. This course has been being run virtually in the COVID era. Hopefully I'm not dating myself by saying that. Virtually, it actually takes a bit longer. I think we've all learned that virtual training, virtual conferences require more attention. So you can't run for an 8-hour day of training. People just burn out. So this is basically given over a day and a half now. There are 2 advanced level courses, which basically cover when I showed the processes earlier, one set covers the more strategic processes, the other covers the more operational processes. 2 days for each for that. And then there's an expert course, which really is less about the standard FitAssembly, but more about how to implement a service management system within an organization, how to do auditing, how to ensure conformance. It's kind of like a mini management training course for organizational implementation of systems. It's a very good course, but it's actually much harder. This is a couple of days as well. So this training is available and has certainly been provided, a lot of it within the EOS-c-hub project and within the EOS community in the last couple of years. Why are people doing this? Hopefully some of this should be obvious to you already. I think in the research sector, there's definitely been a shift from publications and products to services over the last 10 years, certainly going from FP5, where I started in the EC funded world, through FP6, 7, Horizon 2020. Things are very different now. You don't just leave some outputs at the end of your project, you're expected to leave a service. This requires you to manage those services. If you want to make those sustainable, because they require you to continue operating, you don't just put the results somewhere in a repository. This requires some management structure to deliver that and also to understand how much it's going to cost. And this has been a big cultural shift. Most people in the sector weren't given the information they needed during their training to do this. So they need additional professional training and support to be able to become service providers. And that is what a lot of us are now, less researchers, more service providers. This goes along with a sort of commoditization of digital services. Everything is as a service now, which means it is delivered as a service and has to be treated as such with some management to go with it. And like I said, there is a skill gap, which is why people are quite hungry for IT service management for systems like FitAssembly, because they want some way to understand how to do all this, and they didn't get given it during their education, during the earlier stages of their career. Who's using this? Again, this is a very partial list, quite a lot of organizations, and many of which I provided training to myself, but also quite a lot of federations and projects have in the past or are currently using FitAssembly. This is only the ones we know about. There are many FitAssembly training organizations that I know little about, that are independently created and just accredited with one of the certification bodies, ISO Cert or APMG. So I imagine the real list of this is far bigger. These are just some ones that I'm aware of in our sector. So if you're interested, if all of this makes sense to you, if you feel like you need this sort of support, where do you get help? If you're interested in ITIL and ISO AC 20000, there are a wealth of trainers, consultants, and documents commercially available. You'll pay for all of it, but it's out there and it's good stuff. And certainly once you start to understand something about IT service management, using the resources from ITIL and ISO AC 20000 is a really good idea. If you follow my advice and think FitAssembly is the way to go, which obviously I would say, but I think it's definitely more appropriate for our sector. It's pretty widely used in the research community now. It's freely available. It's been used within EOS-c-hub. We have our own service management system that we use to deliver services, and it will be used, we believe, as well in the next phase of EOSC building in EOSC Future, where the EOSC service management system will continue with these processes and the policies, procedures, processes that we discussed earlier. There is training available, and there is training available certainly with some financial support, often for free at the foundation level through EOS-c-hub. In fact, we've done the advanced level as well. Obviously, you may or may not know, we're coming towards the end of EOS-c-hub. It was due to finish at the end of this year, but will be extended for a few months into next year. I imagine there will still be training opportunities available in the new year. These are normally for anyone to register for. So if your organization is interested, normally you can get 1 or 2 people through some basic training. There are also a number of EOS-c-hub, well, at least one EOS-c-hub partner who provides paid training and consultancy. That's my own organization. So we do in-house training for a whole bunch of people. So if you want training that is for a whole bunch of your staff at once, this is often the better way to go. But there are numerous other commercial providers as well. I'll put a link in here to the list of current FitAssembly providers from the APMG website. This is the certification body, the accreditation body we work with. And in 2021, there will also be organizational certification available, not just personal certification. And then finally, coming to the end, back to EOSC. Why were we interested in all of this? Why did we go on this little journey from EOSC through to FitSM? Well, with ITSM, there's a number of things you can do. You can rationally understand your activities, and you can work out what your services are, what you offer to your customers in terms of value-generating activities. This is generally makes a lot more sense to your users and customers than a massive list of everything you do in your organization. And normally you find your portfolio of services or resources will be far smaller than you think because it will gather many activities together. It lets you deliver and manage your services or other resources to some extent, and it lets you make promises about them and then back those promises up with structures that allow you to say, if I promise you this capacity, well, this is how I planned it, this is how it relates to my financial resources, this is how I make sure it's secure in terms of information security, etc., etc. And it'll certainly let you fill the EOSC provider and resource profiles easily. If you go even down this route a little bit, you'll find those things trivially easy to fill in because that's really what it's asking you. Also, I think it supports the connection of services through integration and support for composability, because by taking a standardized approach to managing services, and these approaches really work with all service types that you can come up with, it makes it much easier to plug them into each other because they're all conceiving of things in the same way. And finally, it really does assist, and we found this in my organization, in sustainability planning, because by having a clear way that you generate value within an organization, you are able to clearly say what are the costs of those services, and then plan for being able to fulfill it, have enough income for those costs. So thank you for your attention. In a moment, we'll switch to some questions, which I think my colleague Rob will deal with.
Thank you very much, Owen, for that wonderful presentation of service management in the context of the EOSC. Thanks as well to those who are joining us watching this on demand. Now we're going to be ending the recorded part of this presentation.